everyone, Kelly here. I am finally getting around to talking about my favorite books that I read back in 2021. The last month has just been a bit hectic, so I'm finally getting around to talking about these, and I'm splitting them up into two videos because I'll talk a little bit real quick about my stats and that I had a lot of 5-star reads. So I just wanted to kind of split them into two videos. So before I get to those stats real quick, just so you know, this video is going to include all of my favorite nonfiction, romance, classics, and contemporaries. And then I'm doing a second video with just the speculative fiction, so like the sci-fi and fantasy books. So let's start off just talking a little bit about my stats, because I don't want to do a whole separate stat video because I don't keep very many stats. I just wanted to kind of tell you about how many books I read and how many, like the percentage of them that were like 5 stars or 4 stars, like ones I really loved. So I ended up reading 243 books total in 2021, which was a lot. I would really like to not necessarily read that many books, just because, you know, it would be nice to do some other things in the years. But it just happened to be that I read a ton of books last year. I'm sure that was due to being home a lot for homeschool and because of, you know, what's going on in the world, that we weren't out and about as much as we normally do. And then, of course, I do include some of the books I do for homeschool, so it ends up with a lot of books. And then of those 243 books that I read, 55 of those were 5-star books, ones that I rated 5 stars. And I didn't want to talk about all 55 of those books because even though I might have given it 5 stars, it might not be an all-time favorite. It might just be that I really enjoyed it in that moment, but now that we're at the, you know, the next year, that I don't hold that book as like one of my favorites of all time. So, but I still think it's great that I read 55 books that I really loved in the moment I was reading them. And then also in terms of my 4-star books, I read 105 4-star books, which means that 65% of the books that I read were 4 and 5 stars. And I would count a 4-star book as the one I really enjoyed as well. And so that's really great. I think that it was 65% of my reading was 4 and 5 stars. Now I am going to split these into kind of like categories and talk about them in those categories. So the first category is nonfiction. And the reason is I wanted to start with of this list of books today, this is my favorite book of the year. I'm just gonna put pictures of all these because I just don't want to seek them out if they're in my house. It's one of those days where I'm like, it'll just be easier not to pull things off my shelf. So the one I really loved and want everyone to read is How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And this was just such a great book. My husband and I listened to this together when we were driving at Thanksgiving, and we both were like, okay, we need to get other people to read this book. It's so good. Clint Smith is a journalist and he's also a poet. So you could tell that through this book, how his writing was really beautiful, but also like really fast paced and compelling, like journalist writing. And so I just really liked the way he wrote this book. And basically what this is about is that he took some time and went around to a bunch of different places in our country and then one in Africa that are related in some way to the history of African Americans. So like a lot of these revolve around slavery, so just keep that in mind. And just like wanted to go to these sites. So like, for example, one of the first ones in the book is Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. So he goes there, he takes a tour, he talks to the tour, like he, you know, just goes through the regular tour and like comments about what they tell the public in the tour. And then he like interviews the tour guides or the people that work for these monuments and things like that. And like kind of talks about the history of the location. And so I really enjoyed how he mix both like, you know, things that he studied and he like would do research and talk about that research, but then he also just put in exactly what he was talking to these people about. So it might not be things that he agreed with, but he's telling what their opinion is of the site. And so I felt like it was very informative, and not that it was unbiased, because obviously he has a bias, but like he put in information that he wouldn't have agreed with to kind of like show how different people view these monuments and locations that are really relevant to the history of our country. It was just a really impactful book. It like almost like my husband and I were talking about when our kids get to probably middle school, because some of these would be pretty intense, maybe even high school, that this would just be a list of places that we would want to take them as like, not for fun, but like to like learn about the history of our country, because I think it's really important for us to learn about the really hard parts in our history so that we don't repeat similar things in the future. And so I think it's important for people to know where we come from, what happened in our past, and some of the things that maybe we want to keep hidden. So, or like the way we reframe these locations in a better light, even though they have a really hard history and things like that. So I thought this was an excellently written book. We listened to an audiobook, like I said, he narrates it and he has a really great voice as well. So I'm probably gonna talk the most about this one because I just really loved it and think that everyone, especially if you live in America, should read this book. And now continuing on to the next nonfiction, I read I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. And I really love this book because this is kind of like a memoir slash series of essays where Austin Channing Brown kind of talks about her history and kind of how she fits into like her being a Black woman and working in a field that's predominantly white people, but like white Christians. Like she works in Christian organizations who kind of say they're not racist or don't have like these kind of racial biases, but maybe they don't see that they do and things like that. And I really enjoyed this because I have also worked in, before becoming a mom, I worked in Christian jobs, like jobs in the Christian world, like through churches, or I worked for like a church, like church organizations, things like that. And I felt like I could connect to her position in which she was working, but then also hearing her perspective as a Black woman working in those same kind of jobs that I had. I just thought that was really important for me to hear, because then it's like something I'm very familiar with, like a part of culture, or like a part of the working world that I'm familiar with, but from a viewpoint that's different from mine, if I'm saying that correctly. So I thought it was really informative. I don't think you need to be a Christian or have worked in the Christian realm to get a lot out of this book. It's just how it connected to me personally through reading it. But I also just think her talking about her life and her experiences, like for the fact that where her name come from, she talked about that at the beginning, that she was given a white man's name, Austin, because her parents wanted to make sure that when she got older and was going to be writing resumes, that she had a name that would get her in the door. So I just thought it was fascinating to hear a lot of the things from her point of view. And so I would definitely recommend this one. And then my last nonfiction pick is They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. This is a graphic memoir of his childhood. When he was a child, he and his family were put in a Japanese internment camp. And so he is telling this from the parts he remembers, but also interviewing his family and things like that and hearing their memories of their time in the camp, because he was very young. I think he was only like, 5 or 6, I don't know exactly, but it was definitely young enough that not all of this is from his memory, but he talks about how he discussed with his father what was actually happening in the camp and things like that. And this was just really well done. I think I also am just glad that he, as somebody who is famous, he was in Star Trek and he is a very, famous actor, that by telling this story of something that was really hard in his lifetime, that he can share a part of history that maybe not all Americans have learned in detail, and see it from somebody that they recognize from TV. Obviously, Star Trek's not on TV right now, but a lot of us have seen his face and all that. And so it might draw people into coming to his memoir more than maybe somebody they haven't heard of. And I think that's really important that he is able to share that. And this was, it had moments that were really tough to read, but since it's also from a child's perspective, there are moments of, light and happiness, because his family, loved him so much. His mom tried to make it as normal as possible. She insisted on bringing her sewing machine with her when they weren't allowed to bring hardly anything, so that she could sew for them new clothing and curtains for their little, cabin that they had to live in and things like that. And so there was just those moments of you could see the family love and all that stuff while they were in a really horrible situation. So I just really enjoyed reading this one, and it also kind of inspired me to read some other things from World War II that I haven't really touched on, because I feel like we get so much about the Holocaust, which is obviously a very important part of World War II that we should be learning about, but there are lots of aspects to World War II that maybe don't get as much things written about them, or maybe just don't get as much attention in history class and things like that. So I think it's an important story to know about. And then moving on to romances, I had a couple romances that I really enjoyed this year or last year. And the first one was People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. And I just really like Emily Henry's adult romances. I like the way she writes conversations. I feel like it feels like real people talking. This one is about two friends that they've been friends since college, and every year they would go on vacations together in the summer, even when they weren't living in the same area, and that was kind of like their way to connect every year. But then something happened 2 years ago that made it so they don't talk anymore, and I can't remember the names of the characters, I'm sorry, but our main female character really wants to bring back their vacation time, and so she calls up her guy friend and is like, let's do one more of our vacations. And so we're kind of going back and forth in time in this book, current time when they're trying to bring back their friendship, and we're kind of like working through all the issues and things like that, learning what made them separate 2 years ago and not talk, like what the rift was in their friendship. But then we're also going back to the very beginning when they first met, and like going through all of the vacations over like a 10-year period, so we kind of see how their friendship develops and all that stuff, and then turning into a romance. And like I said, I wasn't my favorite of her ones that I've read so far. I preferred Beach Read, but I still gave it 5 stars because I just really think her writing is compelling. Like, it makes me want to keep going. I like the conversations. I think it was the time jumps that were the thing that I didn't like it as much as Beach Read, because I like a more like flowing narrative. But I will always like read her adult romances because of the way she writes a friendship or a relationship building, like conversations and working through issues and things like that. I just really enjoy it. The other romance that I loved was The Governess Affair by Courtney Milan. This is a novella, and it's kind of like a prequel novella for one of her series. And this was the book that I read by Courtney Milan that like established that I'm just going to pick up most of the things she writes, because I'm not like the hugest fan of historical romance, but I like the way she puts a lot of issues from the time period in this, so it's not just a romance. So this is a story about a woman who is a governess, and she is pregnant by I'm trying to remember if he's an earl. I can never remember the titles of people, but he's a person high up there, and he fires her and doesn't give her any compensation or take charge of the man at all. I think he's a duke, actually. And so he hires like his guy, his fixer, to go and take care of her, because she's kind of like protesting by just sitting out in front of like the duke's house, just waiting to get some kind of like recognition or payment or something to help with her child. And so he sends the fixer, and then her and the fixer, like I said, I'm not gonna remember any of the people's names because this is a long time, but her and the fixer kind of like have a lot of banter, and it's just like really interesting watching them learn from each other and things like that. I don't want to go into a lot of detail since it is a novella, but like I said, she deals with like issues of the time. And so I thought the talk about sexual assault and how to like move on from sexual assault, and not like that you're going to forget it and heal completely, but how you are still capable of loving after having a traumatic experience in the past. And so I really liked that like arc in the story, and I just really loved the like banter between the two characters, which I have found is something I like about Courtney Milan's writing in general, but this one specifically, the banter was like top notch. I like the kind of like slow way the romance developed, and yeah, this was a key one to teach me that I really enjoy the way she writes her romances, and it's my favorite so far of all the Courtney Milan I've read. And now moving on to some classics that I loved, and these actually come in different forms. I have a short story, a play, and a novella, I guess would probably be what it would be called, and of the classics that I want to talk about. So the first one is A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell, and this is a feminist short story classic. So this is, it's hard with a short story to like make it succinct, but basically there has been a man who has died, and his wife is accused of his murder, and the neighbors are the ones that kind of like told the police that the murder has occurred. So the neighbor, the man who is the neighbor, is coming with the police officer to, search the house and kind of find out what happened. And the neighbor's wife comes along in order to gather up like clothes to take to the accused wife in prison. Like, that's her job, is to gather clothes to send to the prison. But while she's there, her and I don't know if she's the police officer's wife or the mayor's wife, these two women, the neighbor's wife and this other woman, basically solve the murder, but the men aren't paying attention because they think that women aren't intelligent enough to figure out things like that. And so there's this whole like thing of like women's business is not important and is kept separate from the man's business of like being the smart one and figuring things out. And I just thought that it was really cleverly written and a really good story. It's also a play, so you can read it in either version. The short story is called A Jury of Her Peers and the play version is called Trifles. So you can read either version. I think they're probably gonna be similar. I'm gonna read the play later this year and find out if they're exactly the same. But I really thought this was a well-written story. And then moving on to the play that I loved, which was The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. This is just like one of my favorite plays of all time. I just really enjoy the way Oscar Wilde writes comedy of manners. And this one is just really hilarious. It has like two men who are going by the name of Ernest and two women who want to marry men named Ernest. But like, you know, there's lying going on and hidden identities of like true identities and things like that. So there's a lot of that mistaken identity and comic relief, and just like the conversations are hilarious. I love it. It's a little over the top and ridiculous, but that's what's kind of like great about it. And so if you haven't read The Importance of Being Earnest, definitely read it. Or if there's some way to watch the play version, but don't watch the movie, because I did watch the movie after reading it and they changed a lot of like the dialogue, and I'm just like, Oscar Wilde's dialogue is perfect. Like, you should not change it. Like, you can't make it more funny than it is. And so I was a little disappointed after reading the play, watching the movie. So it's still like, it's one of those plays that you can read and you wouldn't have to have like watched it in order to like get all the humor and stuff like that, because he just really is great with the way he does conversations. And the last classic is The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is one of the stories, or the longer stories, like the novellas in the Sherlock Holmes canon. And it's my favorite of all the Sherlock Holmes books or stories. I just think it's so good. It definitely has that like gothic feeling compared to a lot of his other things. And it's not taking place in London, it's out on the moors. And so it has this like definitely gothic feel and atmosphere that's so fun. And basically what happens is a murder happens out on the moors, and the people around think there's something supernatural going on, that there's this supernatural hound that basically caused the murder. And of course, you know, Sherlock with his logic thinks, oh, something else is happening here. And so he sends Watson out to check it out and interview everybody and things like that. And like I said, I just love the atmosphere. I love the gothic feeling. I love the big old house and the possibility of something supernatural happening and like just little creepy bits that are going on. But yeah, I just think of all of the stories, the Sherlock Holmes stories, this one is my favorite. And it's not one that you would have to read like in order. So if you just have never read anything that in the Sherlock Holmes world and you just want to like kind of get a feel for their like relationship, like Holmes and Watson, and also kind of how he solves a crime, this is the one I would suggest to start with because it's just like my favorite. And finally, the last category I want to talk about are contemporaries. So the first one is All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley. And this is a young adult novel that is about it's about police brutality, basically. So we're following two different perspectives. We're following a white teenager and a black teenager. And the black teenager at the beginning, he goes to this convenience store and there's like a misunderstanding between him and a cop. A police officer thinks that he is, I don't know if he thinks he's stealing or attacking a woman or something, like a white woman or something like that. And he beats up this black teenager, you know, claiming that he's resisting arrest, but really the black teenager just doesn't understand what's going on. He's like, I didn't do anything. Why are you coming at me? And why are you trying to arrest me when I haven't done anything? So that's one perspective. And then the other perspective is this white boy who was there the night that that this all happened at the convenience store, but he didn't see all of it. He only saw the tail end, and he knows the white cop. He is like best friends with the brother of the white police officer. So this police officer is kind of like an older brother to him or a mentor. So we hear from those two perspectives, and I really like how we hear from both sides of the story, and they're not really opposing sides, but we hear from two different sides or two different perspectives on the event, and I think that that is really good, especially for teens, to hear, you know, different ways of seeing a situation, and also how you might be there and seeing a situation, but you really don't know exactly what happened because you're not like in the middle of what's going on. And I just think it's a really important story of something that's happening a lot in our current society, and just something that we should still be in conversation about. And so I think this is a really well written book that covers this topic, and so I would definitely recommend it. And then next I have Wonderstruck by Brian Selznick, and this is a middle grade novel that is told from two perspectives, and one perspective is completely in drawings, because Brian Selznick does, all of his books have like drawings and art in some way, and so like I said, one is completely in art and the other story is all written out prose. And they do have like a connection between the two stories, and so you just have to kind of see how it flows out. There's also a lot of talk about being hard of hearing or being deaf, and so that's like a big theme in this book. And I just think both stories are really beautifully done. I like how you can just like follow this perspective of this girl who is deaf, and just like her whole story that's in pictures, and really see how she's feeling and what she's going through, and not have any writing at all. I just thought that was really beautiful the way he did that. But then I also liked following the boy on that was written out, his perspective, and kind of him like, you know, discovering a new friend and all this stuff. I don't necessarily want to go into all the themes, because since so much of it is in illustrations, it looks like a thick book, like it looks like, you know, a 600-700 page book, but it reads really fast because so much of that is just like full page illustrations. I don't want to go into a lot of the themes and like detail on the plot, but I would definitely recommend it. I've only read a couple things from Brian Selznick, but so far this is my favorite, and I just think it's a really interesting way to tell a story, and was really good. And the last book I want to talk about is Amina's Song by Hannah Khan, and I had read Amina's Voice when it came out a few years ago, and so this is the sequel. And so, I mean, it wouldn't be a spoiler because it's just like, you know, following a girl's life and things like that, and I'm not going to talk about anything that's spoiled from the first book. But basically, Amina is a young girl who is Pakistani American, and so like she, at the beginning of this second book, her and her family are just coming home from a visit. They went to Pakistan to like visit like family members and things like that, and she's just coming home, and so she's riding this high of like being on a vacation and learning more about her heritage and her culture and things like that, and wants to share it with other kids at school. And they're doing kind of like, I can't remember what it is exactly, but it's some kind of like project in class. And for her part of the project, she wants to talk about Malala and kind of like her influence as a Pakistani woman and all this stuff, and she wants to share that. But then the kids in her class, all they're hearing from this story of Malala's history is the negative things. They aren't seeing the good stuff about Pakistan and the culture and things like that. And so Malala is getting really upset about how her classmates aren't really seeing what she's seeing when she thinks about her heritage and culture. And so she's just trying to share that with the other people. She also is kind of learning more about music and her like connection to music. And that was part of what was going on in the first book, how she was like seeing that she really enjoyed singing and things like that. So that continues in the second book. And I just really love this series because I think it, like, I'm not one that really loves contemporary middle grade because I often find it a little boring to just like follow along, like going to school, dealing with bullies and family drama and all that stuff. All of those are important things, especially important for kids to read because they're going through it. But as an adult, I don't necessarily want to read all of that stuff. I don't find it interesting. But these contemporary books, this series, I really love it because I think the friendships and the relationships and the family are so well done and so interesting that I'm just sucked in. So even though it's not a genre that I normally read, like middle grade contemporary, I will just like read probably anything that this author writes because I think she does relationships so well and just like conversations about important issues without it only being an issue-driven book. Like obviously there are issues in this, but it's not like just about that. It's really about a girl growing up and learning more about being herself, being true to herself and her identity and things like that, and also her family relationships and friendship relationships and her place in the world all the stuff that happens in a lot of other contemporary books, but I don't always find as interesting as this. I don't know. It's just some authors have a way to draw me into their characters, and Hannah Khan just does that for me. So especially if you are somebody that likes middle grade contemporary books, or just contemporary books in general about the like growing up, you know, process and coming of age and all that, I would definitely highly recommend this duology. I think it's so well written and beautiful and has a lot of great themes and good things for both kids and things that adults can appreciate too. So that's it. Those are my favorite books that are in the category of nonfiction, romance, classics, and contemporaries. Watch out soon that I will have my fantasy and sci-fi ones coming up. If you've read any of these and want to talk about them, I would love to hear from you down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye.